Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Right, nice to see you all. I don't know whether not Franz Johnson, W.F. Marshall is known to many of you. He is better known in Tyrone. We both come from County Armagh, but near the Tyrone border, shall we say, and I think we have that interest in Marshall. Now, William Forbes Marshall was a Presbyterian minister all his working life, but he was a scholar, among other things, and he wrote a lot of verse, poetry. He was a broadcaster in the 1930s, 1940s, before much recording was done of broadcasts. He was a scholar in various ways. He was interested in the language that people used in Ulster. He was interested in local history. And many of you have heard of W.F. Marshall. Oh, you've all. This is great, because the most difficult talk we've ever had to give was once when we were asked to speak to a young ladies group who were all under 30. And they were charming and they made us lovely tea, but they'd never heard of Marshall and they didn't know what we were talking about. But we enjoyed the tea. You're obviously much better informed. Now, William Forbes Marshall, his family came from the Omagh district, and still marshals around in that area. If you go to find where he was born and where he came from, you'll almost certainly get lost. I'm warning you now. His father was a schoolmaster and became principal of Sixmilecross School. Sixmilecross is a village in Tyrone. I don't know if you've ever been in it. It's not perhaps terribly well known, but if you're going along the road from Belfast, Portadown to Ballygawley on the west, you'll see a sign for Sixmilecross, and a few miles down that road you come to the village. This was definitely home for Marshall, because his father was the principal of the school. He grew up in the school residence, and most of his writing, most of his best writing, is about the area around Sixmilecross. He went to his father's school and then moved on to Royal School Dungannon. A school of which you may have heard. This was important to him as well, and he wrote a few poems about it. The present school library is named after him and his brother, and that was almost as important to him as Sixmilecross. He decided in his teenage years that he wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, and the normal pattern to become a Presbyterian minister was to do an arts degree and then go to theological training in Belfast. Now, Marshall was born in 1888. So all this business about his career was taking place in the early part of the 20th century. Now, if you wanted to get a degree at that time as cheaply as possible, where do you think you would go? No, not to Glasgow. You'd have to get across to Glasgow. No, the cheapest place was Galway. The universities had been opened in Belfast and Cork and Galway as a sort of national service. Galway was not terribly well attended. In those days, Galway was quite a poor area. Not many local people wanted to go to it. There were scholarships available, and getting accommodation was fairly easy because Galway at that time was a summer resort. Some people would go in summer, but throughout the rest of the year, the people who ran the boarding houses were delighted to see anybody. People didn't go to Galway all the year round. It's very different now. Galway is a prosperous, indeed a wealthy place, and people are there all the time. But when Marshall went, he enjoyed quite a small, intimate sort of institution. He made friends, some of whom remained friends for life, and he got his BA degree, and he even managed in his spare time to do a law degree. A bright lad. But he was interested in literature and in poetry at that time, and the first poem I was asking Jim to read is a poem which he wrote when he was a student at Galway. So, Jim, do you want to start?
Alma Mater. On tides long ebbed, drift back the things that were. Long thoughts of youth, when care was still to be, and dear dead days when friendship made life fair beside the western sea. The far-strayed memories come trooping home, till visioned clear beyond her girdling walls stands Alma Mater, and on tower and dome the moonlight, sunlight falls. The scenes return, for greeting one by one, youths at the sea wall near the close of day, the boats of Claddagh, dark against the sun, spots on a silver bay. The heights where Darcy dreamed upon the turf, dim ghosts of Arran in the sun mist clad, tramps in the starlight, while the winter surf foams at the promenade. Grey Menlo towers, from Corrib rising sheer greenness of beach, and white of trailing thorn, and waves lapping on a little pier upon an April morn. The shabby rooms for fellowship was high, the seabirds calling on a moonlit shore, the last June glimpse as town and tide swept by westward of Arran Moor. The best of memories. The friendship leal that lay between us in the pleasant years. God will restore them when his times reveal the passing of all tears. So in life's eve, down memory's long halls, steal morning winds that on the spirit cast the sweet enchantment, ere the curtain falls full on the sunny past. Comes once again the thunder from the tower, the old world streets, the boats at Claddagh rain from the west, and through the lifting shower, the sunlight on the sea.
Right, well, it seems to me he was quite a competent poet, even in his student years. When he had finished at Galway, he went to the Presbyterian College in Belfast and qualified as a minister. Now, this early part of the 20th century was a very lively time in Ulster. All the controversies about Home Rule, people signing the Covenant, and so on. And Marshall was interested in this sort of thing and took his part in it. He claims he was involved in smuggling weapons for the UVF. He gave that up when he became a minister, I suppose. He thought it wasn't terribly suitable. But he was interested in politics in his own individual way. He was a member of the Orange Order and the Black Preceptory and the Masons and the Unionist Party. But he was also a great admirer of the United Irishmen, which isn't as unusual as all that, because while he didn't want separation from England, he wanted the sort of social improvements which the United Irishmen were trying to pursue. When he qualified, after a bit of time as an assistant in Belfast, he got the job of minister in Aughnacloy Presbyterian Church. He liked this because it was getting near home. It was the area of Ulster speech in which he already had an interest. One story he used to like to tell about Aughnacloy was in those days there were controversies in the Presbyterian Church about, well, first of all, whether you should sing hymns or just stick to psalms. And then secondly, there were controversies about whether you wanted musical instruments or just using ordinary voices. So he talked about one old elder who was in Aughnacloy who struggled not to have an organ in the church. But the vote went against him and an organ was installed. And this man who had to pass it when he was going out of the church always made sure that he kicked it. That's a very Presbyterian attitude, seems to me. Then war came, 1914, and many people joined the army. You see this recorded in the war memorials in churches, in towns and villages. Many people lost their lives. And one of the best poems, which I think Marshall wrote, was called The Lad. It's about a young chap who went off to serve in the army in France and lost his life. And this is the next one that Jim will read. And I'd like you to notice the change in the language. The first poem that we heard could have been written by anybody in the United Kingdom. It's in standard English. But The Lad is different. Jim, The Lad.
The Lad. They were no great offset anywhere, the Scotchers times ago. For drink, it followed the best of them that wrought among the toe. Plenishment they'd have little or none except for what they'd steal, and they'd make the childer go out and beg gowpens of oaten meal. I know the Scotcher wrought the Shane. He was a drunken scrub. But he reared a son, and I mind the son a smart wee lump of a cub. His clothes were wings, and his cap was tore, and his fire was the fire to kill. And he went to school on his wee bare feet, and never got half his fill. Above the mill was a queer big hill, he could see to the graveyard wall, to the market house and the station gates and the new Hibernian Hall. You'd hear him singing going up the hill, but the dear knows why he sung, for the people thought they would see the day that his da would sure be hung. When the 12th was near, he'd march the road, his drumsticks in his hand. Boys, he was prime at the double rowel on the tin of an old tin can. He played his lone, for other folks were ashamed of him and his rags. So he trinnelled the soup and waited the burn, and ginnelled for sprickly bags. I mind the year he took up with me. The plan had just begun. I'd watch him leading the horses round the drunken Scotcher's son. Little I thought that afterwards more than a son he'd be, for his father died in a water shock, and he come to live with me. He was odd in a way. I think he heard what nobody else could hear, and he seen what I could never see, although my sight was clear. The top of a hill bewitched him still, and the flame at the mountain's rim. But a running burn was the best of all, for he said it sung to him. There were some that went that far as to say he was sure to turn out wild, but the wee lad grew, and he grew man big, and he kept the heart of a child. The longer he lived about the place, the less I had to fear. There was never a word from him to me, but done me good to hear. I'm feeling old since he went away, and my sight is getting dim. I never asked to keep him back when they needed men like him. He's sleeping now where the poppies grow, in the coat that the bullets tore. And what's a wheen of medals to me, when my own wee lad's no more?
Now, first of all, you notice a difference in the language from the first poem. That is not a poem that would have been written by people all over the British Isles. He is using the speech of Tyrone. It's like reading Robert Burns. You sometimes feel you need notes at the foot of the page to explain what the terms are. There's also a lot of feeling in it. It seems to me this is our version of the poems that were written about the First World War by other poets in England. And one thing I came across recently is the fact that Marshall had a younger brother who came home from North America to join up and lost his life. Now, this is not mentioned much in Marshall's writings, but I think maybe the feeling comes across in that poem of losing somebody. So, after a spell in Auchnackloy, Marshall got the job as minister of Sixmilecross. This was coming home, and in some ways it's quite a compliment, because when you grow up in an area, the people know you, what you've been like as a child and a young man, and if you have any blemishes in your character, everybody knows about it. But people in Sixmilecross were quite clear they wanted William Forbes Marshall to be their minister, and he settled into the church and remained in it for quite a few years. It was an area that interested him in various ways. Sixmilecross is a village in a fairly low-lying area. It's not very prosperous. The farms around it don't seem to me to be terribly good. The land isn't very good. But there are a lot of stories about it. Outside the churchyard, there's a hill called Tullyneal. Tullyneal means the hill of the O'Neills. And this was an important place for Marshall. It cropped up in a lot of his poems. He liked the word. Sometimes, indeed, when he published a poem or a story, he just put the name Tullyneal at it. But people got to know that Tullyneal was Marshall. But one of the poems later we'll hear about the way in which he saw Tullyneal as representing his own history, where the story of how the O'Neills were there, what happened to them, the various people who came and took over the land. In general, it was an important place for him, and right at the end we'll have a poem where we see Marshall saying that he wants to be buried in Tullyneal. But he soon became to have a following for people who had an interest in the language of Tyrone. And one of his most famous poems, Me and Me Da, which is the one we're going to hear next, is in some ways a humorous poem, although there's a lot of social history in it as well. So, something a bit lighter than The Lad. This is Me and Me Da.
Me and me da. I'm living in Drumlister and I'm getting very old. I have to wear an Indian bag to save it from the cowl. The daily man in this town land was cleaner than me. But I'm living in Drumlister and clobber to the knee. My dad lived up in Carman and kept a servant boy. His second wife was very sharp. He buried her with joy. Now she was thin. Her name was Flynn. She come from Cullentra, and if my shirt's a tratty shirt, the man to blame's my da. Concerning women, sure it was a constant word of his. Keep well away from them that sin, their tempers easy riz. Well, I know too, I thought would do, but still I had my fears, so I kiffled back and forth between the two for years. Wee Margaret had no fortune, but two rosy cheeks would please. The farmer land was Bridget's, but she took the pock disease. And Margaret, she was very wee, and Bridget, she was stout, but her face was like a jail door with a bounce pulled out. I'll tell no lie on Margaret. She thought the world of me. I'll tell the truth. My heart would leap the sight of her to see, but I was slow. You surely know the reason for it now. If I left her home from Carman, my da would raise a row. So I swithered back and forth till Margaret got a man. A fella come from Mullislin and left with just the one. I mind the day she went away. I hid one struck an hour and cursed the wasp from Cullentra that made my da so sour. But crying cure's no trouble. To Bridget I went back and faced her for that night week beside her own turf stack. I asked her there and spoke her fair, the handy wife should make me. I talked about the land that joined, but perhaps she wouldn't take me. So I'm living in Drumlister, and I'm getting very old. I creep to Carman once a month to try and make my soil. The daily man in this town land was cleaner than me, and I'm dying in Drumlister and clobber to the knee.
Right. Well, that's maybe the best known of Marshall's poems. Drumlister, I've been along Drumlister. In fact, I've met a young lady who lived in Drumlister, and nobody's in Clobber to the knee now in Drumlister. There's some quite expensive houses along that road. Now, we are tempted to regard that as just a comic poem, but I know that Jim, in his teaching days, used these poems as social history, which you could tell the children about, the sort of things that were going on in those farms in the 1920s. No electricity, no television, of course. Radio hadn't yet arrived. what did you do in the winter evenings? It was dark and cold. Men didn't seek a wife until the farm had been left to them. By that time they were middle-aged and the girls had gone. And so there was a lot of loneliness which comes through. There's another poem which is, I suppose, like chapter 2 of that one. And that'll be the next one that Jim read. And it tells you a bit more about life. I should say the names of places. Sometimes he refers to the cross. Well, the cross is Sixmilecross. Carman, or sometimes known as Tyrone. Well, in English that would be Carrickmore. The local names come through and they almost need a dictionary to tell you what they are. But anyway, we're going to hear one more poem from that era.
Sarah Ann. I'll change my way of going, for my head is getting grey. I'm tormented washing dishes and making drops of tea. The kitchen's like a midden and the parlour's like a sty. There's a half a foot of clobber on the street out by. I'll go down again the morrow on my Kelly to the cross, for I'll have to get a woman or the place'll go to loss. I fathered all the cattle and there's nothing after that but clocking round the ashes with an old tom cat. My very ears is buzzing from the time I light the lamp, and the place is like a graveyard. Well, bear the mayor would give a stamp. So often I be thinking and contriving of a plan of how to make the match again with Robert's Sarah Ann. I used to make wee Roberts on a Sunday after prayers. Sarah Ann would fetch the teapot to the parlour up the stairs, and once a week for certain I'd be chopping at the door. There wasn't one would open it but her, you may be sure. And then, for all was going well, I got a neighbour man and took him down to speak for me and asked for Sarah Ann. Did you ever know wee Robert? Well, he's nothing but a wart. A near begone old devil with a wee black heart, a crooked, crabbed creature that is neither well nor sick, journeying in the chimney corner or going hopping on a stick. Sure, you mind the girl for her'n that went shouting through the fair? I wintered at wee Roberts, I can summer anywhere. But all the same, wee Robert has a shop and farm of land. You'd think he'd do it decent when it come to Sarah Ann. She bid me ax 100, and we worked him up and down, but the deal I hid he give me but a cow and £20. I pushed for 20 more for buy to help to build the bar. You might as well be talking to the stone behind the fire. So I says to John, my neighbour, "Sure, we're only losing time. Just let him keep his molly, he can do without her prime. Just let him keep his daughter, the hungry-looking nure. There's just as chancy women in the countryside as her." Ma'am, he let a big trevally, and he sent us both, you know. But Sarah busted crying, for she seen we meant to go. She fell to the crying, for you know she isn't young. She's nearly past her market, and she's civil with her tongue. That's half a year or thereaways, and here I'm sitting yet. I'll change my way of going, and I'll do it when I'm fit. She's a snug, well-doing woman, no better than Tyrone, and down I'll go the morrow, for I'm far too long my alone. The night the wine is whistling, and it's coming on to sleet. It's spitting down the chimney at the grease she get my feet. It's whistling at the windy and it's roaring round the barn. There'll be piles of snow tomorrow on more than Mullaharn. But I'm for tackling Sarah Ann, no matter if the snow is everywhere she going. Where the morrow comes, I'll go.
Right. So Marshall was becoming well known in Ulster. These poems were published in local papers, and they came to be gathered together. I have some of the versions that appeared. You can pick them up occasionally. Verses from Tyrone, Tyrone ballads. The version that we're using is this book called Living in Drumlister, which is a more recent collection of his best poems. The Blackstaff Press, it's the best-selling poetry book the Blackstaff Press has ever published. It's introduced by Andy Todd, who was a fellow minister of a younger generation. And I think he has selected the best of them, it seems to me. I've looked through some of the other collections, but I don't think there are many that Andy Todd missed. So Marshall was enjoying quite a bit of local fame. And it was a bit of a surprise to many people when he left Sixmilecross. I've talked to people about this, including Andy Todd, who knew him, and it seemed to be that it was really for financial reasons. Sixmilecross is a small village, small church, not very many members, and the salary was the lowest that you can pay in the Presbyterian church. And Marshall had a family of, I think, 3 children who all wanted to go into higher education, and he really needed more money. So he applied for the job in Castlerock in the north coast, which was a bigger church, an area where there were more Presbyterians around, more income, and that is where he spent the rest of his career. It's a pleasant area, and Marshall, he wrote some poems about it. The scenery is beautiful, but it seems to me that the poems he wrote about it were never as good as the poems he wrote about Sixmilecross. It's maybe a fact that poets can write more easily about the world they grew up in than what happens to them later. I can think of other poets, even recent times. It seems to me, I'm no expert on Seamus Heaney, but it seems to me that Seamus Heaney's poems, the ones he wrote about Garva and the work that they went on the farms, were better poems than the poems he wrote about New York and England and Dublin, but others may disagree. So Marshall went off to Castlerock and spent the rest of his career there. There's a memorial window to him in that church in Castlerock. But even there, when he wrote poems, they were quite often about Tyrone. And there's one that I will be asking Jim to read, which is Our Son. Now, this is also illustrates some aspects of life in Tyrone. There's a place mentioned in it called Athenry, which is actually in County Antrim. It's not the Athenry that figures in a more recent song. So, can we have Our Son?
Our son. He was only a cub, big-eyed and shy when he travelled across the sea. A sorry cub when he said goodbye to the hills of Athenry. Trig and decent he went away, his fortunes for to win, with a good warm suit and a muffler gay, and a wee round trunk of tin. But he landed back last calm and fair in the grandest Yankee clothes. His specs are such as the Yankees wear, and the chat comes down his nose. And he's big and fat. Though I mind him slim with a waistcoat white and smart, and by heavens the luggage he brought with him made the full of a donkey cart. The wife's from Clare. She was reared in suit and she scrubbed a Yankee floor, but now she's nothing from head to foot but a jingling jewellery store. Chains and bangles and rings that shine, buckles across her toes, rings in her ears. If the woman was mine, I would turn a ring in her nose. And she's a woman like soft to lie. How could she sleep on a shelf? How could she wash herself? Oh, she'd cry, except in a tub of delf. Soup she wants, and coffee bedad, liver and bacon and fish, and salad's a thing that must be had, kale cut up in a dish. So our son's at home, and under his skin he's the very same to see as the boy that carried his trunk of tin down from Athenry. Sure, he left in turf and fetched to go of water the day he came. But his mother and me, the two of us know he'll never be just the same. For what do you think? The man would chew the bit that goes into her mouth, and the wee back room it would never do for the flipe that was reared in the south. So he's taken a house with a bath and a lawn and marble clocks that strike, and he motors to see us off and on. A kind of a stranger, like.
Well, these are the poems probably that most people enjoy. But Marshall had many other interests, and I want to take a few minutes to talk about some of them. He was interested in local history and in Ulster history, and he was picked up by the BBC, and he made quite a number of broadcasts. Not broadcasts that have been recorded, because recording really only became popular after World War II, when tape recorders were available. He wrote a novel, Planted by a River. It's quite a good novel, but it's set in Tyrone, and it is something in common with Lorna Doone, it seems to me. And he took this interest in Ulster speech. His view was that Ulster Speaks, I've got a little book here which is a collection of some of the talks that he gave for the BBC. His view was that people in Ulster should not be ashamed of their speech, their accents, their words. That when they went to school, certainly in the 1920s, 1930s, they were quite often taught to try to speak standard English. That speaking as the Ulster people did was somehow bad grammar. It was incorrect. And Marshall took the view that it was not incorrect. They were simply using a language which was different, but just as good a language as standard English. He gave talks on this. He tried to get more recognition of it, and he was successful in many ways. He got a group of actors, amateur actors in Tyrone, to perform a version of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. And this was broadcast by the BBC, unfortunately never recorded. But he wanted to do this because he had a view that the speech that Shakespeare used was closer to the language of Tyrone than most people had realised. He set out to write an Ulster dictionary. He was ambitious about this. He wanted it to be like some of the Oxford dictionaries where you had the origin of the word was given and the few quotations compared with other things and so on. And he wrote quite a bit about this. I've seen some of the ledgers which he used to write it up. He never finished it. His story was that he had a lot of the material on cards, and in the manse he had a young dog, and the dog got in and got at the cards, chewed them up, shook them up, and made such a mess of it that Marshall decided to give up. Now, I have some doubts about this story because I'm not sure how much damage a dog could do. When I was a teacher, sometimes pupils would tell me if they didn't have homework done, "Sir, the dog ate it." Well, I didn't always believe them. It seemed to me that dogs never seemed to eat girls' homework. But it was just too big a job for one man at that time, it seems to me. When an Ulster dictionary was eventually produced, I don't know if you know this book, Concise Ulster Dictionary, published by Oxford University Press by academics. And this is what Marshall would like to have done. Now, this is a well done. If you come across a copy of this book on the charity shop, buy it, because it is now worth a lot of money. It's Oxford University Press published one edition, and after that, no more. So I looked it up in Amazon to see if there are copies. You could get a copy for £57. So, but one of the things that these people, the academics who produced this, they were saying the same things as Marshall had said. The English that was spoken in Tyrone was not Ulster Scots, which is what is spoken in parts of Antrim and Down. It was the language of planters who came to Armagh and Tyrone and brought with them their English. Now, Marshall's view was that this was the language of Shakespeare. And the same thing is here in this. Those from England originated many of the parts of their home country, as the name of the city of Londonderry suggests, and the majority came from the West Midlands. Now, the West Midlands, Warwickshire, is where Shakespeare came from. And Marshall developed the theory that if you wanted to hear Shakespeare read with the nearest accent you could get to the Warwickshire accent, the place to go was Dungannon. He had a version of, as I said before, the Midsummer Night's Dream read for the BBC by actors from Tyrone, amateur actors. So, if you want to have a tea when you go home, and you go home and you ask somebody to produce a sup of tea is what Shakespeare would have said. And there are quite a lot of other examples of that kind that Marshall discovered. He broadcast about this. He broadcast about the Ulster people who went to America. That's now quite a big subject pursued by academics, but Marshall wrote a short book about it in the 1930s before the academics had got onto it very much. So he was interested in things other than just being funny. He was a social historian who was interested in the poorer people of the Sixmilecross area. The latter years were spent in the north coast, Castlerock, and that was the time I'm old enough to have actually met him. When I was a student at Queen's, I got to know a student called John Marshall, a student of dentistry. And I had never heard of W.F. Marshall at that time, but I got to know John reasonably well. And I was up there in the Castlerock area at one time, and I met W.F. Marshall after he had retired. He was a very contented man, it seems to me. He liked the life. He had quite a large manse, and students would appear, and he wasn't sure how many people were in the house on any particular night, but he didn't seem to worry too much about it. That was his life. He had a brother, R.L. Marshall, who was more of an academic, but who also wrote some poetry. R.L. Marshall was a professor in Magee College in Londonderry, and they were very close to one another. And one of the good things about his living in Castlerock is that he was quite close to his brother, and they got on very well. When he retired, he had problems with his heart, and he was aware that his life was not going to be lengthy. He made a big effort to produce one good final poem which summed up his life and his attitudes and his faith. And that, I think, will be the last one that Jim will read. And you'll hear about Tully Neal. You'll hear about many of the things we've mentioned earlier, and how much he liked Tyrone.
Tully Neal. On that grey hill in dark Tyrone, that lifts its shoulders broad above a house of weathered stone, a plain old house of God. The winds embroider now the lea, the cattle come and go. Crab apple blossom, fair to see, warms up the white thorns slow. An oak tree lifts his ancient head in majesty sedate. The maple leaves are furnace red down by the churchyard gate, and that Te Deum sweet and strong that follows lifted rain is in a lofty blackbird's song, far answered down the lane. Of old were often posted here men swift to bear the steel, in belted gown and fighting gear, the swordsmen of O'Neill. But that was long and long ago, ere Hugh left land and home to break his heart in exile slow and die in distant Rome. The memory is misted now of Con and Hugh and slain, for strangers came to speed the plough across their great domain, and yet, while Tully Neal is named here in my countryside, something of what was feared and famed abides, and will abide. Enchantment waited here for me in boyhood's golden day, and still each gate and hedge and tree can sweep the years away and conjure pictures of a kind no canvas can retain. for I can paint them in my mind and live my youth again. Their splendour where the great seas roar across a northern strand, and break and pound the patient shore, and fill the shining sand. But I was born in old Tyrone, and love the quiet things, the burn that chuckles round a stone, the song a blackbird sings. The little byroads free from dread, where one has time to wait and pat a horse that holds his head across a roadside gate. The summer hum of honey bees, our Sabbath peace unflawed, our green God's acre in the trees, our plain old house of God. Such things are tethers to my feet when my departure nears. These are the old friends I meet, unmatched throughout the years, who learned with me in days long gone that 2 and 2 make 4, and told with me a chalk line drawn upon our schoolroom floor. Here is their meeting house, the place where Sabbath prayers are made, and here in Tullyneil's embrace their dead and mine are laid. So maybe on another day lonesome I shall not feel, when I come back again to stay content in Tullyneil.
Well, William Forbes Marshall died in 1959, and he is buried with his brother in Tullyneil. That is the graveyard of Sixmilecross. The church is still there. It's not big enough to have its own minister anymore. It's joined with another congregation. In fact, not so long ago, the manse was up for sale, and I think Jim and I joked that we could take it on and conduct the tours of it, but it would be a rather expensive thing to do. But there's a big, on the gate of the manse, the gate post, there's a big blue plaque to say that this was the home of W.F. Marshall. So I hope that has been of some interest to you, a man who had quite a varied life and took an interest in various types of scholarship, but was basically a Tyrone man who enjoyed living with the farming people in Sixmilecross. Thank you for listening so patiently.